Let's go ahead and take a look at our next example. Here we have a graph, and this one has multiple parts to it. So let's go ahead and start with part A. We want to find f of 0. So let's make sure we know what the question is asking us to do. When we're being asked to find f of 0, what they're giving us here is an x value of 0, and they're asking us to find the y value that goes with it. So if you take a look at our graph, when x is 0, right, our y value is 4. Right, so f of 0 is going to be equal to 4. On this next one, we have f of 3 pi over 2. Right, so they're giving us an x value of 3 pi over 2. And they're asking us to find the y value that goes with it. Right, so we take a look at our graph. This is the point, right, where x is equal to 3 pi over 2, and the y value that goes with it is a 0. And on our last one here for part A, we want f of 3 pi. So here's 3 pi on our graph. Right, the y value that goes with this one is a negative 4. Let's go ahead and take a look at part B. This one is asking us to find the domain of f of x. Let's talk about what it means to be a domain first. Okay, when we're looking for our domain, we're going to be looking for the x values on our graph. You might also see this referred to as the inputs, or the independent variables. And if we're taking a look at the picture of a graph, we want to ask ourselves, well, how far left and right does this graph go? And we're going to be using interval notation to write our answers, right? So we're going to need the smallest x value, and then the largest x value, and some combination of brackets and parentheses. So let's take a look at our smallest x value first. So if we're looking at the blue portion of our graph here, my smallest x value is going to be at an x value of 0. My largest x value the graph stops somewhere over here, right? And if I'm looking at x values, I'm actually looking at this point on my graph. So my x value here is going to be 4 pi. So this graph goes from 0 to 4 pi, and I want to know, is the 0 and is the 4 pi included or not? And if you take a look at the graph, those are both solid dots that you see on each of those. So recall that solid dots are going to be where it's included, so we're going to use brackets on both of those pieces. So that would be our answer for our domain in interval notation. If we're talking about the range for part C, we're going to be taking a look at the y values. Right, this would be known as our outputs, or our dependent variables. When we're taking a look at the graphs, obviously we're going to be taking a look at how far up and down our graph goes. And we're still going to be using interval notation. We still want to make sure that we use our smallest y value first. sure you're looking at the y values here. And then we're going to be looking at our largest y value. So off our graph, let's go ahead, if we're looking at the y values, the lowest point on our graph is going to occur down here, right? These are y values of -4. And it's going to go all the way up until it reaches kind of this peak up here. Each of those points has a y value of +4. And then we can go ahead and ask ourselves the same question: are these numbers included or not? Both of those are solid dots. They are places where our function exists, so we are going to put brackets on both of these. Part D is going to ask us to list the coordinates of the intercepts. Since it's phrased this way, we want both the x and the y-intercepts on this one. So let's go ahead and do the y-intercept first. We'll make sure we put it as coordinates, right? So my y-intercept is going to be the point 0,4. And my x-intercepts, I have a total of 4 of them on my graph. So my first one is the point pi/2, 0. I have the point 3 pi/2, 0. 5 pi/2, 0. And my last point here is going to be 7 pi/2, 0. Alright, so a total of 5 intercepts for part D. Part E asks us to find how often the line y = 2 is going to intersect our graph. So let's go ahead and sketch the line y = 2 first. Alright, here's my y value of 2. So this is going to end up being a horizontal line that goes through that y value. And we can take a look at how many times it's going to intersect our graph. There's once, twice, 3 times, 4 times. And for part F, for what values of x does f of x equal -4? So remember that f of x is the same thing as a y value. Okay, so they're telling us our y value is -4, and they want to know what are the x values when this occurs. Okay, so we have 2 points down here. Both of these points have a y value of -4. So x is going to equal pi and 3 pi for part F. Let's go ahead and look at part G, which is the last part of our question. This one is asking us to find the values of x where f of x is greater than 0. So let's talk about what this question is really asking, because this is one of the most challenging questions that you're going to come across. This is asking us to find the same thing as where is our graph above 0? Or you can think of it as where is it above the x-axis? Right, because f of x is the same thing as a y value. So we're looking for where y values are greater than 0. We want it to be above the x-axis, not necessarily on it. So let's go ahead and highlight the portion of the graph where it's above the x-axis. If you're working with these types of questions, don't be afraid to get your highlighter out so that you can mark up your graph. I think it's going to help you along the way. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight the portion where it's above my x-axis, and I have 3 pieces here. Each of them highlighted in yellow. And now we want to go ahead and write these using interval notation. We want to make sure we account for each of those 3 intervals. So let's go ahead and start with the first one. Okay, keep in mind I want to list my smallest x value for that interval and then my largest x value for that interval. So my smallest x value is going to be a 0. My largest x value for that interval is pi over 2. Now we have to go ahead and put either brackets or parentheses on these. If we're looking at the 0, keep in mind there's a solid dot there. It's clearly above the x-axis, so I'm allowed to go ahead and use a bracket on the 0. And at pi over 2, you see that there's a solid dot there, however, that is on the x-axis. And I'm not looking for where it's on the x-axis with this question, I just want to know where it's above it. So I'm not going to include the pi over 2 in this case. So this one's going to get a parenthesis. Let's go ahead and do our middle interval. All right, I'm going to go ahead and do the entire interval all at once. My smallest x value here is a 3 pi over 2. My largest x value for this interval is 5 pi over 2. Again, I want to go ahead and use either brackets or parentheses on these. Notice that at each of those 2 points, you're actually on the x-axis, and I do not want to include those numbers, so I'm going to go ahead and use parentheses. And then for my last interval, my smallest x value here is 7 pi over 2. My largest x value is 4 pi. And I'm going to have a parenthesis on that 7 pi over 2. And for the 4 pi, that one's clearly above my x-axis. You have a solid dot, so let's go ahead and give that one a bracket. Okay, and then you can go ahead and use the union symbols between each of these intervals, and that would be your final answer.